Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Tales from the Heart, a podcast from the Hypertrophic Cardiomyopathy Association. I'm your host, Lisa Salberg, and today I'll be joined by Dr. Harry Lever, and we have a really interesting conversation coming forward today. We are going to do a little backwards thinking on how we got to the point we are at. So we need to go back in the timeline. Backwards thinking was the bad phrase. We're going to go back on the timeline to 2007. And we're going to build up an entire explanation of why the generic drug issue, the quality of generic drugs in the United States, isn't something new, but it needs to be solved now. Before we get started with this interesting conversation with Dr. Lever, a few announcements for the week. It is June 20th, 2025. And as many of you know, June, one of our topics for the month is grief. And one of the reasons for that is this is the month that my family had endured the most grief in our HCM experience. Last week was the 30th anniversary of my sister's passing. And tomorrow, oh my goodness, I have to do the math. Tomorrow it's 75 years. I got to do the math here, people. I'm bad. 1950, 53, 2025. Yeah, 72 years ago tomorrow, my grandfather had his cardiac arrest. And we didn't know why. He was 42, 43 years old at the time. So for those of you who are triggered by stories in the media about sudden cardiac arrest, there's a lot going on in the news right now. And I'm going to do a broadcast after the podcast today with Dr. Lever to address rumors that come around after a sudden cardiac arrest. And Ann Burrell from the Food Network, like, I'm a Food Network junkie. I watch it all the time. So I've watched Ann's career. We're all saddened by her sudden passing, and she's a very public figure. But there's a lot of speculation about why. And as families in the HCM space know, sudden cardiac arrest brings out so many emotions and so much confusion because they're here one minute and they're gone the next, and it doesn't seem possible. And then the rumors start. So I'm going to address that later. So come back and hear about that about 1:00 today. We're going to do that. But today we're going to talk to Dr. Lever and give him the long version time that he needs to tell the story of generic drug quality and how Dr. Harry Lever at the Cleveland Clinic became a passionate advocate on behalf of generic drug quality. Harry, welcome to Tales from the Heart again.
Thank you very much.
So I remember a day in 2007 when a very angry and very frustrated Harry Lever called me up and said, I just heard something on NPR. Tell me about that morning.
Well, I was driving to work, and that time I was listening to NPR. I got a good bit, and I just happened to get onto this program. And what were they talking about was food and drugs from China. I said, what? And they got into the program, and they started talking about stuff being imported from China. And I got really concerned. Like, how could we be sure this stuff was okay? And what do you mean we're bringing stuff in from China and we're gonna swallow it? And that just was So I listened to the program as I was driving to work, and of course I got to work before the program was over, and I just couldn't continue sitting there. I mean, it was just, I had to go to work, I had to go see the patients. So I wrote down, again, what the program was, and went into work and started Google searching. And and this is what led me to start looking about different drugs and all this. And then what happened was, at that time, there was a problem. As I'm Googling all these things, it turned out that there was a problem with the drug heparin. And that's a blood thinner. It's given intravenously. And I started looking, and then then what happened over the next few weeks is, I remember an article appears in the New York Times that there's a problem with heparin. And what happened was, the Chinese were, and this is the headline from the program. Richard Knox was the reporter. And as a matter of fact, in the recent past, I can't remember really when it was, I was able to get back in touch with him. We've actually spoken, certainly within the year. I don't remember exactly when it was, but we talked to him. And so what happened was, it came out that there were some problems with heparin. And what happened was, the Chinese, actually, first of all, what happened was there was a scientist in upstate New York who was looking for a new anticoagulant. And what he found was he tested the anticoagulant. It was called supersulfated chondroitin sulfate. He tested it in the laboratory in a test tube, and sure enough, it thinned the blood. But when he tested it in the mice, they all died. And because of that, he never wrote the paper about the fact that the mice died. And all they did was they talked about the fact that, oh, there's a new anticoagulant. You can test it in a test tube and it does thin the blood, but nothing went further than that in terms of what could you do with it. Well, the Chinese got a hold of it, and the supersulfated chondroitin sulfate, and they didn't know about the mice dying. And what happened was they started selling this stuff, and there was a nephrologist in St. Louis, pediatric nephrologist, who was taking care of children on dialysis, and she noticed that 4 of them started getting very sick. So what they did was they sent the heparin to the CDC, and they tested it, and they found out that this supersulfated chondroitin sulfate does bad things, makes allergic reactions, all kind of things bad. And but so as a result of that, and seeing what the Chinese had done, I started doing more Google searches. I started just looking at different drugs, and I started not realizing that there were problems. And when I started looking at some of my patients, I found problems.
So let's go backwards for a second again. So this is 2007,
Mhm.
and when we're figuring out, like, how did we get to where we are? And I'm going to show another slide here in a second. For those who are watching the video version of our vodcast, you'll see some of these slides popping up. And for those who are listening, the slides are available on YouTube, LinkedIn, and Facebook, and will also be on the HCMA website. So the Hatch-Waxman Act
Right.
is when we had this pivotal change in generic drug manufacturing.
Right.
So the law allowed drug companies to get more drugs on the market at a cheaper price. It opened up the flow of production, which we needed.
Right.
But it allowed for an abbreviated drug application process for generic drugs, which had less requirements than before. It cost less money to monitor. And the Generic Drug Act required that the generic be between 80 and 120% of the active ingredient in the original preparation.
Right.
So there was these elements that needed to be there. And I think when you're a legislator and you say 80 to 120, it doesn't sound like it's that much. But if you've been on a drug that's 80% of the name brand drug, and then you get put on something that's 120, that's a really big increase in dosage, or a really big change downward in dosage. So this can impact quality of life and a lot of different chemical reactions within your body that make these drugs work.
And the other key thing was they only had it tested in like 30 or 35 normal volunteers. That was it. No more than that. So these studies were done in a very small number of normal volunteers. We had nobody with diseases was tested, and that that's a problem too.
Okay, so the basis of the start of the problem goes back to 1984.
Right.
All well intended, and we don't know the unintended consequences of legislation until we get downstream of it. And here we are. So now we've got 2007. Harry hears NPR say there's a problem, but that's not the only one that said that there was a problem. But it took a while for other media to get into it. But let's go from 2007 forward. And let's talk about the letter you wrote to the FDA in 2010.
Well, what? No, it was 2012.
12.
What happened was, as time went on, I started noticing I was having trouble with some of my patients, particularly the ones with hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. And we had realized for quite some time that metoprolol succinate was a good drug for those patients, and we had them on it, and that was AstraZeneca was the name, was the company that was making the stuff, and I would use AstraZeneca's stuff. Well, all of a sudden, I'm starting to see patients coming in to see me, and they're not doing well. And the question is, what's going on here? So we start questioning them, and all of a sudden, we realize that they're getting another company's metoprolol succinate. It's made by a company called Wockhardt from India. And and it turned out that that company got a hold of 26% of the market of people taking the drug.
Wow, that's a lot.
Yeah. So
One of the top, metoprolol is one of the top 10 drugs
Right.
prescribed in the
Right.
United States.
But they had
It's very common.
26% of the market. And then it also turns out that a little after that, there was another company also that got a hold of some of this, Dr. Reddy. So what would I do when I'd see these patients that were coming in and they weren't doing well? And the question was, well, what are you taking?
Mhm.
And we realized that they weren't taking AstraZeneca anymore. They were taking Wockhardt or maybe Dr. Reddy. So what would I do? I had no means of testing this stuff. All I had was my ability to see the patients and ask them questions and examine them and all that stuff. So I said, look, here's what we're going to do. We're going to change you back to what you were on. We're going to go back to the name brand and let's see if we can. And guess what happened? They got
better.
They got better. And
Mhm.
and so that made me think we've got an issue here. Well, then something else happened.
Mhm.
We started seeing some patients in heart failure that all of a sudden they would go into heart failure. They had been all right, and what did we find? Well, some of the furosemide that they were taking wasn't working right. And there was a company called Ranbaxy that I said, whoa. And I said, there's something going on here. Well, one day I get a phone call from a cousin of mine who had a badly leaking mitral valve. He had had heart surgery and he had bypass, and then he subsequently developed a badly leaking mitral valve. And I said, wait a minute, what are you taking here? It was Ranbaxy. So we stopped the Ranbaxy. Within a week, he lost 15 pounds of fluid. And I said, we got something going on here. We've got to, so we stopped the drug that he was on and we switched him. And then it started happening with other drugs with other people, similar sorts of things. And I would, suddenly patients were getting into trouble and I would stop the drug and switch it to something that I thought would work better. And that was before the insurance companies would tell us, well, you can't use the name brand. And I would
So that compounds the problem.
Right.
So we found a solution, just
Right.
use the name brand.
That wasn't,
And then the payers will pay.
that for the early period of time, that wasn't a problem for me. I would just change the manufacturer. And, when we found this with a number of patients, I had patients, for instance, that we were treating their cholesterol with atorvastatin, and somebody changed the manufacturer, or it totally changed the drug, or to a different drug. So that's how I realized that we were having a problem here, and that's what really got things going here. And then
So
I started slowly meeting other people, and there was a in 2014, I was invited to go, believe this or not, to the Capitol, be part of a press conference with some people, and one of them was that showed up there was Catherine Eban, who wrote the book Bottle of Lies. And when she talked about in her book, what she had talked about was the problem with this company Ranbaxy in India that was making bad drugs.
I'm going to bring some of the photos to the
Right.
screen
And
from
this,
Bottle of Lies.
right.
And for anybody who might recall
Well,
that
this
name,
wasn't in the book, but
Mm.
these were slides that she had sent me.
She had sent. Okay. So we have previously had Catherine Eban on Tales from the Heart. Goes back to the early episodes from my home during COVID. So if you want to look back in our history, you can hear directly from Catherine Eban what she did, what she found, and the entire episode is there. But there were problems with the manufacturing processes and with the cleanliness of these facilities,
Right.
and these images can show some of what was seen there. So there were birds, there were monkeys,
Right.
there are bird droppings on machines that are used to maintain the ingredients for our drugs.
Right.
And there's also a cricket or something up here on the wall. I don't quite know what that is up on the wall there. Oh, you don't
Right.
see my pointer. And those are bird droppings, and those are from Catherine Eban. This one's probably one of the most frightening images
Yes.
I've seen out of all
And
of
that's
it.
from Dr. Reddy.
This was in their plant, and this was submitted for their inspection, correct? That's where this
Right.
one came from? Yeah.
Right.
So it's amlodipine. We don't typically take that in HCM, but that doesn't make it any less scary.
Right. So
And yeah, that's a bug. In case you were wondering, this thing here is a crushed bug on
right.
the actual pill itself.
Right.
And then we have a snake in one of the in one of the pieces of equipment. There's a ventilation equipment. So where else are they if that's the one we're seeing? So I'll just stop there for a second. So you want to talk a little bit more about your talk with Catherine?
Well, and she eventually visited my office. We spent about 3 hours, and she interviewed me, and for one chapter, and then she had, after the book was published, well, it was finished in a way, it wasn't out yet, but she had somebody else, like an editor, interviewed me for another 3 hours, and that's how we made sure that everything was right. And this has just been just one series of things after another, and how I got involved with this stuff. And it was clear that there were problems with generic drugs. And then as the more we got into it, we realized, well, they're making lots of drugs in India, and they're making lots of drugs in China. And as a matter of fact, penicillin, for instance, we haven't made penicillin in this country since 2004. 2004.
Okay, let's go back to your letter to the FDA.
Oh, yeah. So when I recognized that there was a problem with metoprolol, I wrote a letter to Janet Woodcock. It was in 2012.
Tell our listeners who Janet Woodcock is.
Well, she was an official at the FDA, and wrote the letter. And actually, I also had developed a friendship with Joe Grayton from the People's Pharmacy, and he had another problem with a drug, Wellbutrin, that wasn't working well, and he had written a letter. So I said, well, if he's writing a letter, I'll write a letter. And that's how I wrote the letter. Well, it took them 14 months to get back to me to tell me that there was no problem.
But
And I said, and at the same time, I also told her I was worried about furosemide, Lasix, the diuretic. But I get this letter back, and there's absolutely no
mention of that.
There was nothing, no problem. And it just, and then what subsequently happened after the book was written, Catherine put me in touch with an FDA inspector by the name of Peter Baker, who spoke to me, and he said, we got talking about metoprolol, and he said, that plant, that walk cart plant, one of the worst places I was ever in. And you were absolutely right to be concerned about the drug. I said, what? Who could believe something like that? And
I'm going to put up the pictures of some of the things he saw in the plant. This is
yeah,
the walk-art
yeah,
plant, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
I think so. But here we are.
So
And
yeah, this
and
is
and there was, factory problems in the walk cart plant. Very,
published in Bloomberg News 2013.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
So this is what we're dealing with.
that's right.
These are the conditions. Now, this is 10 years ago. Okay. So let's be fair and say this was 10 years ago. I haven't seen any proof that these things have been improved or changed,
No,
but they could well have been. So, but this was 2013. And if you've been diagnosed with anything, your drugs were being manufactured here back then. So just keep that into
but there have
consideration.
but there have been other issues with other drugs and um, the other. So it turns out that now, in the past, you want to talk about what's happened in the past 3 days?
I think we need to show one more slide.
Okay.
And it's the one you showed me many years ago that I cannot get out of my psyche because it was frightening. We talked a little bit about heparin and the problems with heparin in terms of quality.
Right.
So for those of you who are unaware or queasy, I'm going to put a slide up here in a moment. Heparin is created with an element that comes from pig intestines. So the process is never going to be exactly pretty, but unsanitary is a whole other story. This was a manufacturing facility in China, published in 2008 in the Wall Street Journal.
Right.
And you can see the floors are dirt and open. There's rocks and dirt here. You can see the dirt on the walls. You can see the equipment is dirty. There's no gloves on this gentleman over here at the bottom. And this is how heparin was being processed and may still be processed this way in some places. I do not know. Can you imagine the number of contaminants that could be put forth in this kind of manufacturing environment?
Right.
So the level of problems and the depth of problems were all over the place. Cleanliness.
There's also this book that came out from the Pew Foundation, After Heparin, Protecting Consumers from the Risks of Substandard and Counterfeit Drugs. This goes back a number of years also.
Okay. So we've seen the problems. We've also seen documentation through Catherine Eban's book, and we have to bring up Rosemary Gibson as well. Shout out to Rosemary and her book, China RX, which focuses more on the Chinese drug market, manufacturing market. So when we look at those two books and we look at all the data in there, we know that falsified information had been provided to inspectors. We know that there are cases where name brand drug may have been crushed down and reformulated into a pill that looks like that manufacturer's pill. There's been a lot of gameplay for quality when they've checked. We've seen this documented in multiple research and multiple investigative journalistic opportunities. And now there's a new one. So back in April, ProPublica published their first in a series of articles about generic drug. And I'm going to swap my screens here for a second so I can pull up all the names and titles properly. There, we'll put that one back up. Where did my search go? Oh, here it is. So it was on April 16th, 2025. An Indian drug maker investigated by ProPublica last year. So they had already been on the case. They've been on this for about a year and a half. They've been researching it.
A year, they say.
It's been over because it's actually been almost a year and a half now.
All right.
So Glenmark Pharmaceuticals, which is a name you've heard Dr. Lever talk about before as problematic, had recalled 24 generic drugs sold to American patients, but FDA didn't notify anybody. They recalled them, probably in people's medicine chests, but there was no real notification that there was a recall. So that's a bit of a problem too. So ProPublica started with that article. And then 3 days ago, 2 and 3 days ago, there were 2 new articles that dropped. We spent a year investigating how the FDA let risky drugs get to the US market. It's a great read. Please read it. And then there's the other one, Threats in Your Medicine Cabinet, the FDA Gambles on Americans' Drugs. So there is a national inspection right now of what's going on here. If you have been following HCMA's work in this area, you'll know on April 9th, we went to Capitol Hill, and during our Capitol Hill briefing, we featured the generic drug quality problem and a pathway to correction. So we're not here just to complain about a problem, even though Dr. Lever has kind of been an independent advocate out here on behalf of generic drugs since 2007. We couldn't quite figure out how to solve the problem if the FDA wasn't going to have the regulatory space to do it or the interest in changing the regulatory space. So some very smart people that we're now working with collectively thought about this from a different perspective. And one of them is a guy named Vic Suarez. You can go hear from Vic in our briefing. He was in the Department of Defense. You want to tell me a little bit about how you met Vic and what he was able to do? And
Well, we I met him through, as I remember, David Light, and the way I met David Light was very interesting.
Tell everybody who David Light is for those who haven't followed.
David Light has a testing laboratory in New Haven, Connecticut. And what happened was, because of that, that meeting that I told you I went to at the Capitol in Washington. Well, there was a reporter there. Her name was Anna Edney, and we met each other and we became friends. And in 2019, right before COVID, she wrote an article about me. I had had a patient who had hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. And he had been a very sick man. We got him through surgery and was doing all right for about 3 years when he suddenly goes into heart failure. We admitted him to the hospital. We got rid of the fluid and discharged him. And within 3 days, he called me back. He was in trouble again. So first thing we did was we said, well, let's see what medicine you're taking. And it turns out that his pharmacy changed that diuretic was torsemide, and they changed the manufacturer to a company called Hitero from India. And I had not heard of them, and I was really worried. And what I had his wife do, come to the Cleveland Clinic. We stopped that drug the one that he was on, and gave him the one we were using at that time at the clinic. Within 3 days, he was better, and we did not have to readmit him to the hospital. So somehow, I can't remember how the story got to Anna Edney, and she wrote it up. I had my picture in the article and all that stuff. Well, within a day or two, either before or after my article, David Light was written up about the fact that he's got a testing laboratory and all this. So I see the article and I said, I got to meet this guy, because this is the first time that I ever would have had any ability to get drugs tested. And that's how we met him. And we become very good friends, and it's all.
And next week we'll be all together for a long webinar on this topic with all the players and explaining exactly how we're going to go about solving the problem. So this is kind of the pregame to get Harry's perspective in the long version, so you can hear all of the details. So you're going to see a lot more next week from all of these players. So we're not going to leave you hanging. We're going to give you the solutions. I just wanted to jump in and say that quick, Harry. So I know that I thought David found Vic. I found out during our pre-con meeting last week that Vic actually reached out to David just like you did. He said, wait, I think this is really helpful. So David is at Balasher. Vic is inside the Department of Defense, and he did 27 years duty to our country. Thank you, Vic. And he's the one that said, no, we really should be inspecting these drugs because we're giving them to our
But
military.
also importantly, he was the one that got the COVID vaccine out for the.
Yes, he was part of the
Right.
COVID vaccine task force for the DoD.
Right.
So the guy knows
Right.
the
He's
guy
very,
knows the
very
game.
smart. Very
He's
smart.
incredibly intelligent. Go watch the Hill briefing. They come in about 45 minutes into the briefing, so their section is there. Go watch the briefing. You'll get all of the data there. And I'm going to give them a teaser, Harry. I pulled up some of David's slides here real quick. Let me just do another slide share. So tell them a little bit about what David and Vic created in terms of their processes.
Well, so what's happening now is the Defense Department has realized that there's a problem with drugs. They're really worried about the soldiers, and they've decided to test 40 different drugs. And they're in the process of doing that now. And here, there's some metoprolol. And what the key thing that we're doing is using different things. We're grading drugs. We're calling them either green, which is really good, yellow, which is sort of in between, and red is bad. So what we're hoping over the next couple of years is we will have a fairly large number of drugs that we've graded. So we'll be able to tell people, look, this manufacturer has been making green drugs, no problem. This other one has been making, and we don't have the names released yet, but making red drugs. So if we grade them as red, don't take them. And that's what we're hoping, that we'll be able over time to try to decide, which drugs to recommend so that we can make sure that people get better quickly. Because when you think about this, for instance, if you're treating heart failure and under Medicare, if a patient gets readmitted to the hospital within 30 days because the heart failure recurred, the hospital has to pay a fine. So that costs money. And we have to, not to mention the fact that the patient feels badly and maybe will even get into worse trouble if the heart failure comes back, just from a medical point of view. Forget the heart failure, forget the money for a minute. Let's talk about their life. So if you don't, what we're hoping is we're going to be able to tell people, look, you don't want to take red drugs. Take red drugs, you're going to get into trouble. We had one experience with a patient that when we tested them, the patient came into the hospital, had non-obstructive hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, and suddenly went into heart failure. Had been stable for years, suddenly went into heart failure. And I had never seen anything quite like that.
So let me walk through this slide with them as you're explaining this situation. I want people to understand what this table is.
So this is basically what we're scoring the drugs based on what the different tests show, and what the dissolution rate is and all that kind of stuff. But at any rate, this guy that came in, he when we tested his metoprolol succinate, it dissolved within 1 minute. 1 minute. It didn't hang around long enough to do anything. And when we realized that there was a problem, the guy was admitted to the hospital. His ejection fraction had gone down. We put in a defibrillator into him. One of my associates did it, and he once the manufacturer was changed back, he has done better and feels better. But this clearly, there was a bad problem with that manufacturer. So what we're hoping is, in general, we're going to be able to get an idea of where we stand, and that's we'll know which drugs better to use. Now they're in the process of doing it. It's taking time, and they've tested a number of drugs, but that's what we're hoping. We get all these different drugs tested, and we'll have an idea of what to tell people to take, and then of course we've got this article from PubPublica that there were all kind of problems with the FDA. And one thing you must understand, The FDA, for the most part, did not test drugs. All they did was look at the data from many of these drug companies. The drugs were really not tested by them. This testing we're doing now is independent of them. And that's what we're hoping, that we're going to get the word out and get things turned around.
So if you go back to the briefing, you will hear a little bit more detail of this. I'm going to walk through this slide really quickly and explain a couple of things that I just think are important to know. So a dissolution rate is how the drug dissolves in your body and how it breaks down. It is a very complicated process to break down these molecules properly so that they are taken into the body as intended. So when you see a dissolution rate that has a number in this field, it should not have a number. See, label 0, 100%. It's all clear. There's nothing else in there. There's no carcinogens, there's no toxins, there's nothing. It's the drug. 90%, the dissolution isn't 100% right, and that's why you're only getting a 90 here. But that's still okay. It's close.
Right.
But look at some of these where it's a negative 21. Negative number here. That's the only one I've ever seen that's a negative number. But the dissolution rates aren't right. And there are toxic elements in a large number of these drugs. So when they come up with something that is a red, they don't trust the one lab. There are 5 other labs in a network, and another lab is chosen to confirm that red score. And if they don't confirm it, then they have to kind of start back at the beginning again. But they've all kind of been confirmed at this point, from what I understand. So if they get a bad score, there's a process in which to review them. And this has been going on for a couple of years now at the Department of Defense. And this has allowed DOD to say, okay, wait, this is worthy of continuing to research other drugs. So they've done a few. Tacrolimus and metoprolol are the 2 that I've been focused most on because it's impacting the largest percentage of our community here at HCMA. So we're happy to say that we found a path through the Defense Authorization Act to encourage the DOD to continue doing this research project, but make all of these findings public on the platform in which large health systems and PBMs buy their drugs. So imagine if the people that are buying millions of doses of drugs can see this scoring system. And there's another slide. I'm going to take it down for a second and find it because there's lots of slide decks here. I want to show you the price comparison. Here it is. So the price. There is no correlation between quality and price. So I know it's tiny on your screens, and you can go to the webcast from the Hill Day and see it better. I forget what this is. Metoprolol. So there's some metoprolol that's down at 19 cents a pill. This one's 4 cents a pill. Yes, that's what they really cost people. I know that's not what your copay thinks, but here you got 4 cents a pill, $2.89 a pill. There's good low cost generic drugs. There's good drugs out there. There's quality drugs out there, and they're inexpensive. Why would we pay for poor quality drugs? Why would you pay for poor quality anything? Like, why? You wouldn't. So we're going to give this information to those who buy the largest number of drugs and hope that they look for quality and good price and make that available to their constituents, whatever the health system is. So I just wanted to make the point that price and quality, you can't say, oh, because it's low quality, it's low price. No, it's actually higher price in some cases. So let's figure out what we're buying and make sure as consumers we're getting what we need, and as patients we're getting what we need, and as physicians prescribing, that you know what your patients are receiving.
Right.
So really, really important. While we have some data on some generic drugs, we don't have it on all, and we can't assume that the problem is only where we're expecting
And there's one very important lesson that I tell people about. When they go get their medicine at the pharmacy, you look at the capsules or the tablets in the bottle before you take them out of the store, and don't walk out with something that looks different. That's one way to get into trouble. If they change the manufacturer and you're not aware of it, and that can be a major problem. And we are going to have to do whatever we can to make sure that that doesn't happen. There's a class of drugs that are seizure drugs that if you go to the state of Utah, the law out there says that the pharmacy is not allowed to change the manufacturer unless the physician gives permission. And right now, the problem is pharmacies are changing the manufacturers, and many physicians are not aware that the patient's drugs have been changed. And that's how we got into the trouble with the one patient where the metoprolol succinate dissolved within 1 minute. The pharmacy changed the manufacturer, and nobody was really aware of it till the guy got into trouble. So one lesson learned here is whatever you're on and you're stable on it, if you're clinically stable, do not change the manufacturer.
And if there is an issue with the drug shortage, they can't get it anymore, whatever, have a conversation with your pharmacist. Now, if it's a big chain pharmacy, there's not a lot of control that they have about where their drugs come from. You may want to go to a smaller pharmacy system.
Well, things now may change.
Yes.
We are now hoping that something's going to change here as a result of this information. The stuff that's been exposed that the FDA has not done. And that's what we're going to have to hope, that a lot of these things are going to be in the past, and we're going to change what happens to people's lives because we've recognized that there's a problem. And I think that we've got to hope for that and work on it to make sure that,
well, let's go back to real world. You're at the pharmacy. They give you the bottle. You open the bottle. The pill looks different. You don't throw it back at the pharmacist and yell. What you do is you say, this has changed. Where was this manufactured? And are there any FDA warnings against that manufacturer? Pharmacist isn't going to know. You might have to sit there and do some research. I'm trying to make some processes a little bit easier so you can search your own drugs and you know what the manufacturer's histories are. Haven't figured out how to quite create that yet. Any techie folks out there that want to help us build a system, we're all ears. Once this is implemented, we'll be able to go and get this information in a very easy way. And then we can make it a little easier for you to know which manufacturer you're getting. So for right now, if your manufacturer changes, just note how you're feeling. If you have any different symptoms, if you're more tired, if you're more awake, if something has changed, just make note of it. It might not be bad, but it may be different. And if you want to make sure that you don't have that variability, at least with metoprolol, the company Milenta is offering authorized generic. So basically as close to name brand as you're going to get, manufactured in the same place. You can get that through the GoodRx card. Just have your physician write your prescription, dispense as written, and it's Toprol XL, and give it to the pharmacist with a GoodRx card, and it's about $30 a month. It is more expensive than a generic. I know that, and not everybody can afford that, but if you can, and if it's something that you worry about, that's how you can make sure that you're getting the name brand drug. We do not benefit in any way, shape, or form for mentioning that. We just know that this is what is beneficial to patients with HCM, and having good beta blocker coverage is important for us. You know that when you get to the end of your dose, if you're not feeling well enough, maybe the drug stopped working 8 hours in because it's generic. Talk to your doctor about that. You may change your dosing time. It's supposed to be a once a day drug. A lot of people take it twice a day. So let's make sure you're taking the right dose for you. If you're a transplant patient and you're on tacrolimus,
right,
really important that if your manufacturer changes within a week, go get your blood levels checked. I got caught in this. I was on a drug that was overdosing me, pushing my TAC levels up too much. That manufacturer has been pulled from market. And then I went on another one that made my tacrolimus levels, for those who don't know, that's what keeps you from rejecting your heart. Kind of a big deal. It went down to below therapeutic. So they want you 6+. And I live at 6.8 to 7.2. These are my numbers for 8 years. I changed manufacturers. I went down to a 3.8. Now, had I just taken my pill every day for a month and waited for my next refill to come in and see what manufacturer that was, that would have opened me up for an entire month where I was at risk of rejection. I worked really hard to get this heart in here. I don't want to waste it on a $5 drug. So I think David Light said it best when we were doing our Hill days. she's got $1 million heart that you're willing to risk for a $5 drug. And I'm like, yeah, no, I'm not. So I have to pay extra every month for my copays and deductibles to get name brand drug to keep myself alive. And that's what I need to do. We all have to make our own decisions as to where we're going to spend our health dollars and why. Kind of think it's important you know where your drugs come from and that they're the quality that we know that they need to be and that they're giving you the results that you expect them to give you. So, Harry, we've gone from NPR 2007, Lisa, there's a problem, to almost 20 years later, actually working on operational changes at the federal level where we can ensure that all Americans can trust their generic drugs. I think that's pretty impressive. Look, took a little longer than we would have liked,
Right.
but how do you feel about something actually happening?
Well, I'm really happy. I mean, I just in the past 3 days, it's just incredible what's gone on, and I'm just very excited about it, and I really want to see this finally find it fixed. We've gotta make sure that what we swallow works. And one of the other important things that has got to happen is every batch of drugs has to be tested. Everything that goes to the pharmacy has to be tested. Right now, that's not happening. There's another major problem. When drugs are shipped, and if they're too hot, those drugs can be destroyed. And we've got to make sure the shipping is done in a way so that we don't waste these drugs and people get into trouble. And when you think about stuff, how is things being shipped from overseas? You know, they come in by airplane, or they come, and what is the temperature? They come in by ship. How are they getting here? What, you worry about tariffs. We're all talking about tariffs. Well, what about what's going to happen to that drug when it's getting shipped, and how are we shipping it? We've got to know that. And that's part of the testing. We've got to really know.
So while we can,
what we are doing, we are giving people medicines so that they feel better, so that they get better, and all what that happens is they're getting bad stuff. That's serious. Now, on the good side, though, what has been tested so far? About 10% we have found so far, but this is still a small number. Only 10% has been really bad. That's from what David Light tells me. But we've got to be really sure about, what's going on, and we've got to have the rules have to change. Testing must be done because we're talking about people's lives.
Well, you're talking about people's lives and you're talking about health economics.
Right.
So to save literally fractions of a penny on a dose, to risk the potential of a hospitalization seems a little penny wise, pound foolish,
Right.
to quote my grandmother. So why are we not thinking about the whole patient and the entire process? I do need to take a moment here to kind of just do a level set. I'm wearing a lot of purple nail polish lately. It's my signal that I'm tired of polarized conversations. We all need to have conversations, even if we have different visions of what this country should be in the next 10 years. I can't think that there is anybody that would say, yeah, let's just put really low quality drugs out there for people to get sicker on. No, we are dealing with chronic disease in this community. Our patients can't not take a drug. They will decompensate. They will get sicker. We want to keep them as healthy as we can with genetically abnormal hearts. We know how to do this. We know what to do. We know how to make people feel better with hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. We know how to protect them from sudden death. We know how to extend their lives. But if you're giving us bad drugs and you're allowing it into the country, this is a problem. This is not a red or blue problem. It is a purple problem. Everybody has a heart. Everybody's taking drugs. Everybody's taking drugs for chronic illness, allergies, all kinds of things. We want to make sure all the drugs coming in have the opportunity to be reviewed and checked to make sure we're not putting contaminants or low quality drugs into people, making them sicker. If they're manufactured in the United States, great. If they're manufactured overseas, great. They all need to be inspected. Everybody should be sending us the highest quality. And if not, be afforded the opportunity to take corrective action and produce another batch of drugs and get them retested. We're not saying because they have a bad batch, they're out forever. They need to be better. They need to clean up their act and make a quality product, and then we'll be happy to buy it. So wanted to just kind of level set there that this is not a left or right. This has been going on for, almost 30 years that we're aware of. The first time I had a bad generic drug, it just didn't operate the same way, was the generic for CoreGuard, and it was 1996. I grabbed it before I was leaving town on vacation, and my heart rate would just not come down out of, I was like 100, 110 all the time.
That's the year I met you.
It is the year you met me. It is the year you met me. Wow. Getting old here, Harry. Been doing this a while. Been a long road. And we've fought a lot of battles. And I'm really happy that we have a destination for this battle. That's going to be on the quality. So why the quality is degraded are good questions. So you brought up temperature. And I want to bring up climate for a minute. We're seeing it's summer here in the US. We're seeing the intensity of the storms. They're changing. They weren't like this years ago. Everything's a little bit more intense. The heat is up in so many ways. But we're not talking about the transportation of drugs. We gave up a long time ago on the brick and mortar and tried to push everybody to mail order. And since the first time that was brought up of pushing to mail order, I said, what do you do when your drugs are sitting in the mailbox all day in the middle of the summer? They're going to heat up really, really hot. And some of them should not do that. It can degrade the quality of the medication. And then, as y'all know, I travel a little bit. And I've been stuck on a tarmac or two in my day. And you look out on the tarmac and you see transport planes sitting on the tarmac, not air conditioned, going God only knows where. I live in New Jersey. I see the tankers coming in down in Elizabeth, tankers coming in with God only knows what, sitting in the heat for days and days and days. What are we doing to manage the temperature for drug delivery? We're not really doing much. What is the impact? I can't say that I know for everything, but Harry, you and I know a mom in Texas who has a child who had a liver transplant requiring liquid preparation of tacrolimus. And one day she reached into the mailbox where her tacrolimus was delivered by mail order pharmacy, and the vial holding her 2-year-old's transplant medication was boiling. What happens when you boil tacrolimus? It intensifies. That's not a good way to deliver drugs. We need to think about temperature control as well. Is that going to be the next great frontier once we finish the generic drug quality problem? Maybe, but they might be combined. Maybe the drugs degrade because of transportation issues. So maybe that's going to be something that we fix as a collateral benefit. But we need to think about it, especially hot months, especially warmer climates. Cold does not seem to be the issue at all. Cold is okay. Heat is our problem. So we need to think about that as well. So I encourage you, when you know your drugs are coming in the summer, to get them out of the mailbox as quickly as possible. Have a friend go pick up your mail that day if you know your drugs are coming. Don't let them sit there all day. We don't really know what the impact is, and we don't want to find out the hard way. So next week, you and me and Christine Jones, who's also a patient and client of HCMA and mentioned in Catherine Ebon's book, Vic Suarez and David Light will be joining us for a very informative webinar. You'll all be able to ask questions during the webinar, and it's next week. Ross, if you could drop the link so everybody can register for that webinar, that would be great. We're going to go into this in depth with the solutions to the problems. I think that Dr. Lever's contribution to this area were so great that I wanted to take an entire episode of Tales from the Heart to just do the deep dive, how did we get here, Harry? And what are we going to do next? So next week, Dr. Lever will give the short version of what happened, and I'll be referring back to this podcast where you can learn all about his amazing advocacy on behalf of generic drug quality issues over the past almost 20 years. So, Harry, I do remember that day in 2007.
Hmm.
And there's some calls where you're like, this is a thing. This is a thing. And I've known it's a thing. We put you on the agenda at the HCMA annual meeting the next year to talk about it. And it became a topic that you talked about a lot. But we didn't know how to fix it. We really didn't know. And now we have a path forward. And as we move for this path forward, it's going to be through a legislative means. It's not a bill. It's part of something called the Defense Authorization Act. And it is a movement for the DoD to inspect more drugs, put them on the national registry so that everybody gets access to that information. That's the short version. You can come learn more and register. We're not getting the registration link directly, Ross. Let's see if we can't find that. Make it easier on everybody to find it. I don't care if you're industry people, clinical people, patients, families. The generic drug quality issue is everybody's problem. It is everybody's problem, the entire ecosystem. I will bring up one other aspect that I did not talk about, and that is the impact on generic drug quality on clinical trials for new medications. Many patients are on background therapy. If your patients are on background therapy provided from their insurance company while they're in your clinical trial, and there is change in that generic, that might tank your trial. Where are your generics coming from as background therapy? We're putting an awful lot of time and money into developing new therapies. It would be tragic if we had a bad generic come into the play and make the trial drug look different than what we think it's going to be. So if you are industry, if you are regulators, look at the background therapy and make sure it's consistent. If you're seeing any issues with your trial, please don't tank a trial when a generic drug might be to blame. Agree, Harry?
Yep.
I went to CVCT, so that's the Cardiovascular Clinical Trialists meeting. It happens every year in Washington, D.C. Regulators come, industry comes, clinical trialists from around the country come. And I watched a presentation 3 years ago where it was statin related. And they're like, yeah, we're just seeing these rehospitalization rates that are not what we saw in the trial. We don't understand why. And this is coming over and over again. We get the trials, but then we get real world. And are these patients all being non-compliant? And I stood up and I said, how do you know that they're actually getting the drug you think they're getting? I explained Hatch-Waxman. I explained the generic drug quality issues. I explained the entire ecosystem. And these guys were just gobsmacked. They're like, we didn't know any of that. These are clinical trialists, really smart people. And they just assumed, like most of us assume, that the drugs that are coming in are inspected and we know that they're what they say they are. So maybe just by having this conversation, we can make those clinical trialists think about background therapy a little bit more and make sure that background therapy is what they think it is and make sure that we are using authorized generics or consistent manufacturers. So, Harry, I cannot thank you enough for all you have done for the past 18 years on this issue, over the past almost 30 years that I've known you, for all of our HCM patients. They miss you in clinic. I hear it all the time. I was just out in Indiana with one of your favorite clients who's doing really well and sends her love. So, any last words from you?
No, I think we've pretty much told it.
We told the story.
And we've
Everybody,
got it. And everybody's got to read ProPublica. It's going to be keeps coming and it's going to keep coming. And they've really done a lot of work.
so according to ProPublica, they interviewed over 200 people.
Right.
I personally know about 10 that they interviewed for this piece from different parts of, the authors and the patients and the clinicians and the industry folks and the DoD folks. I talked to them about my own personal issue. I don't know if it'll show up in anything or not, but it's more, they're hearing these stories in pockets all over the country. It's not just me. It's not just HCM. It's not just Metropolol. It's not just tacrolimus. There's a lot going on, and we all need to come together to fix the problem. So I do what I do, not to bring up where there's problems and point at it. We do patient advocacy to solve the problems. And it's going to take a lot to do that in this political landscape. It's going to be tricky. But we're not arguing with anybody. This is a good thing for all. If you are on one side of the aisle, you might like the idea of bringing manufacturing back into the United States. If you're on the other side of the aisle, you might like the idea of knowing you're getting quality, low-priced generic drugs. If you're on one side of the aisle, you may want more access to generic drugs for more people. Like, there's all different ways that we can move forward in healthcare to help all. I'm kind of a help all kind of girl. So we hope that you want to help all too and make sure that generic drug quality is as high as it can be. We're going to be sending out some communications over the next couple of weeks where you can write to your senators and elected officials to support the Defense Authorization Act language that we're moving forward. Your voice will matter. The community's voice will matter. And it's outside of HCM. Please spread it far and wide when you get our petitions and our communication requests. Okay. Ross, thanks for dropping links. Harry, thank you for your time today and your passion over the past, 30 years or so for our community. Thanks to our sponsors. Joey will drop them here. Hello to my best friend, dog Carl, out in Indiana, who's working with our podcast editor. Always got to give a shout out to Carl the dog. We got to get a picture of Carl one day. When you see him, you will understand why I fell in love with Carl the dog. Thank you all for joining us. Have a great weekend. It is the conclusion of a really tough week for our family as we hit the 30th anniversary of the passing of my sister. But for the first time in a really, really long time, I'm very clearly seeing the impact my sister has had on this world by encouraging me to get into advocacy. And Lori's fingerprints are on all the work that we're doing here too. So miss you, sis. And tomorrow would have been 73. My grandfather would not be alive today. I know that much, but I never had the chance to meet him, and I should have. Another thing that HCM stole, and we're going to try to reclaim control of our health, our family heart health history, and make sure that everybody gets the care that they need. Have a great day. Have a great weekend. Keep up the fight and stay informed.
Yep.
And 3, 2.